So, along with the ideological and social and cultural changes that were emerging out of the Enlightenment, there was also a growing competition among, let's say, these sort of upper class and powerful people of Europe to try and maintain their power against the emerging social ideology that was emerging, right? So we have the Enlightenment that is questioning religion and questioning society and questioning economics. And for the old order, for the conservative order, right, there was this idea that those policies need to stay the same. And in order to sort of understand that, right, and especially as we move forward into the semester, there's going to need to be an understanding of what are we starting with in the 1750s and 60s that we as the revolutionaries and in the age of the revolutions will be changing. So what we're going to be looking at today is sort of a panoramic view of Europe. We're going to look at Central Europe, France, and Britain. And we're going to be talking about sort of what do those different places look like as we come into the mid 1700s. So this is a map of Europe round about 1760. And when you look at it, right, you have things that you probably well recognize, right? So you have something like the Kingdom of Great Britain and the Kingdom of Ireland, right? After 1707, Scotland and England are unified together into one government. We'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But before this, right, there was just a Scotland and an England, and there was a King of Scotland and a King of England. They may be the same person, but they are two separate governments. That changes after 1707. And as we come into the mainland Europe, right, you have the Kingdom of Spain and the Kingdom of Portugal. And of course, we're going to talk about those two locations, particularly as sort of venues of fighting. But we're also going to be looking at, one of the most important areas is the Kingdom of France. And we're going to talk a lot about the Kingdom of France in a little bit. Now, as we move east, right, you'll see that when we get to where Germany would be today, there are some major what are not unified as they are today. So when you move into Central Europe, right, you see, particularly here in the middle areas, right, the yellows and the purples and all those different colors, those really show us small different kingdoms or principalities or duchies or whatever the person called themselves. But what is interesting there is that they're autonomous and they're independent, but they also have allegiances to different groups, right? So one king may be closely bound to another, or they may not be. It's a very tough sort of political web to untangle. And then as we move further east, right, you see the Kingdom of Prussia, which is the most dominant member of the German states, or at least second, tied with the Austrian, what will become Austria. And in this area, right, you have strong military powers, right? So the Kingdom of Prussia, particularly under Frederick the Great, who is king at least at the beginning of the period that we're going to be discussing in this class. He's king from 1740 into the 1780s. Prussia becomes a dominant military power, and the same is true for Austria, which is down here. When you have the Kingdom of Poland, right, a lot of allegiance is given both the East and West here, Russian Empire, etc., etc. So the Enlightenment, we know, already starts in the early or mid 1700s, right? And as those ideas of the Enlightenment are emerging, they're butting up against a lot of the political and the social issues that are emerging throughout Europe, right? So there's within the Enlightenment, right, there are ideas about a separation of church and state. There's the ideas that religious institutions and religion should not have political influence. But when you look at Europe at the time, right, the Catholic Church, particularly in places like France or Spain, or even parts of the Austrian Empire, are very much is very much authoritative, right? The Catholic Church is not just a religious institution, but it's also a political institution. That the archbishops and the cardinals and the priests have local power. And then that is certainly true in places like France, even probably more specifically. But the ideas of the Enlightenment are now saying that why should religious institutions have political power? And more importantly, shouldn't the people have political power, right? The middle class folk and the people who are beginning to earn more money. And this really becomes apparent when people start looking at things like the nobility and even the monarchy. The monarchy less so, because people still believed that the monarchy, the kings and the queens and the emperors, they had political legitimacy. The nobility was less so, right? Because for an average peasant or an average person who is living in, rural France, the king is this far off person. Yeah, you pay a little tax to. You see their flag every once in a while, but they don't really do much for you, or you don't notice them. But the people who did matter and the people who really did dominate much of your life would be the local leader, right? The local baron or marquis or whoever. So the question becomes, why do they own all this land? Why do I pay my taxes to them? Why don't they pay taxes? And those questions and those concerns are really percolating within the Enlightenment period. And people are starting to question legitimately, why do I have to pay tax, or why do I have to pay a tithe? And we'll talk about that. If this more wealthy person doesn't have to. But these ideas change slowly, right? There were still these ideas of feudalism, right? The lord at the top, the peasant and the serf at the bottom, paying their way up. And this old style of land ownership was still very dominant. There was also this sort of place within the order belief, right? That if you are a peasant or a poor person, you are not meant to lead. You are not meant to rule. That is something for the people who are supposed to lead and rule. And there are these, more importantly, right, there are these ideas of the estates, right? When we look at this idea, and this will become very important when we talk about France, but it's also really important when we talk about any of these places. The idea of quote unquote estates is important. The idea here is that power within a kingdom rests in these three groups. The church, who takes care of people's spiritual lives, the nobility, who owns much of the land, and then the everyone else. But the everyone else here, when we think about this in terms of population, the everyone else in a place, again, thinking about something like France, is 97% of the population, 27 million other people. And when we think about this, right, it's not like the poorest people are the ones who they're being represented. They're talking about wealthier landlords, merchants, artisans, really very wealthy folk, right? People who, in terms of real money, are knocking on the doors of the nobility. Again, we're talking about very, very rich people, and there's a major growth out of that. So when we talk about the estates, right, and again, when we look at something like Great Britain, right, Great Britain has their estates as well, right? When we think about the House of Lords and the House of Commons, the House of Lords in Parliament is made up of a lot of lords, right, nobles who have been given their power, but the lords also include archbishops within the Anglican Church, right? So there's this religious connection and this non-religious political connection. And then the commons, it's sort of the everyone else. So this is not just a French thing. It's not just a British thing. It's an all over Europe thing. And Protestantism is also a piece of this, right? Because Protestantism in places again like Austria or Bohemia, which becomes part of the Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia, or in the German states, right? That creates a lot of tension between different places as well. So let's sort of turn and do our panorama now. So within Central Europe, which is the map that you have on the screen now, right? This is what a political map of Central Europe would look like. So you have those German states I was talking about a little while ago, Prussia the most dominant and largest. You have Austria here, Bavaria, Westphalia, Saxony. But it's very tough to talk about these all being the same, because when we look at each of them, sort of where the political power rests changes, where the control rests changes, right? Some are kingdoms, as you can see. Some are duchies. Some are. So you'll see that there's the Grand Duchy of Berg here, but then there's a Kingdom of Saxony. There's the Grand Duchy of Baden down here in the southwest, right? Some have constitutions, others don't. It's very, very strange. One of the things that they all sort of do have in common, though, are these things called diets. Diets are meetings that are held between different groups, right? It's sort of a sort of local parliament, and they all have diets. Now, again, where this gets tricky is the amount of authority that each diet has changes where you look, right? So if you look at a place like Poland, the supreme power is with the diet. But in other places, the duke or the king are the more supreme leaders. But they all have diets, right? Whether that's in Poland or Austria or Saxony or Bavaria or Westphalia or wherever, they all have diets. And that's sort of a political unit that you should just sort of get used to thinking about. Now, again, within this area, right, there's a lot of tension between Catholics and Protestants, right, because of the Reformation in the 1500s. There's a lot of different tensions politically and culturally and socially among the different religious groups, and that gets played out politically and within wars as well. Now, when we swing west and we look at France, we often think about there's this idea of an absolute monarch in France, right? Starting with Louis XIV in the late 1600s, and then sort of collapsing with Louis XVI in the 1780s. That's not true, right? The power really rests within these estates, right? The first, second, and third estate. The first estate being the clergy, the second estate being the nobles, the third estate being everyone else. But even more importantly, when we drill down, there's political power held by all of the different areas of France, right? So if you look at a place like Bordeaux or Limoges or Nantes or Reims, all of these different places have their local parliaments. And as a person living in any of those locations, you would pay your tax to the parliament. And again, the king would be a far off person that you wouldn't recognize, or more than the symbolage, but you would know the local parliament. And even within that, right, the king had to sort of thread a needle with the parliaments, right? The king could not just make blanket authoritative power changes within the government. And that's because of these sort of local autonomous parliaments. Now, within this, right, there's this idea of the Estates General and the regional estates. So when we talk about the events of May 1789 and the lead up to the French Revolution, we're going to talk about the Estates General. And the Estates General comes to Paris, and it's all three estates from all over the country, right? So the first estate, all of the priests and bishops and cardinals send their representatives to Paris. The nobility sends their representatives to Paris. And then the third estate, the everyone else's, send theirs to Paris. The regional estates, as the name would suggest, are meeting in their own regions, right? They're meeting in the sort of provincial capitals, whether that's Marseille, Nice, Lyon, any of those. And they have different rules again, right? Some meet every 6 months, some meet every year, some meet every 2 years. So again, there are these similarities. All regions have parliaments, but they're also different because when they meet, how they meet changes. And finally, the sort of last big straw here within France is taxes, tithes, and confusion. So everybody, all of the commoners, all of the third estaters paid their tax annually. So you paid a local land tax, you may pay taxes on salt. There was no real income tax that we would recognize today. Everyone paid a tithe, which was 10% of their income to the church. So you had to pay 10% of your income to the church. Again, showing the Catholic Church, that is. But because your taxes are based on a parliament and your tithes based on a diocese or a religious map, depending on where you lived and under whose map you fell, you may pay a certain amount, right? So your tithe is always going to be the same. It's always 10%. But if you live in one area, you may pay a certain land tax or a certain salt tax, but you might pay something different than somebody else down the road who's in a different tax map will pay something different. So there was a lot of confusion and a lot of questions of why do I pay X while somebody else pays Y. And finally, when we look at Britain, Parliament in Britain, at least politically, Parliament in Britain was the most powerful. The British Parliament was the agency responsible for taxation. All of that rested with them. But there was also starting to become sort of corruption in how different people got to London for the Parliament. There's what's called rotten boroughs. So under an agricultural system, the 538 representatives within Parliament were broken up based on population, so that, at least theoretically, the whole country had sort of an equal representation. But as people start moving and urbanization begins and different types of farming emerge, there are less people living in rural environments and more people living in urban environments. But there's no change to the distribution of political power. So there are boroughs that have, a dozen people living in it, but they get a representative in Parliament, where London, that had over 1 million people by 1790, only had a handful of representatives, right? So there's this unequal distribution of political power. And again, after 1707, one of the places that has this great misdistribution of power is Scotland. In 1707, Scotland and England unify into the United Kingdom. And when they do so, the Scottish Parliament only gets 45 seats in Parliament, in Westminster, in London. And what that means then is that, for a nation of roughly 300,000 people, they don't have, 1,300,000 people, they don't have a lot of representation. Where in England they do, right? The English have over nearly 500 representatives. And then finally, when you look at a place like the Americas and the other colonies, the ideas of who is British are starting to weigh on people. And what does it mean to be British? And all of these questions start to emerge. The British government does not see colonists as British, but the colonists see themselves as British. And the rights that are given to the British people should extend to the colonists. But if you don't think the colonists are British, then that will not extend to them. So with this panorama of Europe in the 1760s, I hope you see that what we are treading into is a place where there's a lot of confusion and a lot of, we're going to be talking about some key words here, and I hope that this video is helpful in beginning to understand those.